In the brutal world of elite mercenaries, there is one unbreakable rule: the weak do not survive. When they found her shivering in the smoking ruins of her village, they laughed. They said she lacked the spine, the stomach, and the cold blood required to pull a trigger. They treated her like a ghost before she was even dead. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They forgot that ghosts come back to haunt you. This is the definitive story of how the girl they mocked became Iron Wolf's absolute deadliest sniper, and how one single bullet changed the fate of an entire war. The wind over the Outpost 9 ridge didn't just blow, it cut like a rusty razor, carrying the heavy stench of spent brass and burning diesel. Her name was Elena, but in the official digital logs of the Iron Wolf Private Military Corporation, she didn't exist. She was simply logged as Recruit 404, a nameless refugee picked up from the border provinces after the Syndicate warlords systematically erased her hometown from the map. When she first arrived at the Iron Wolf training compound 6 months ago, she was an object of intense ridicule. She was thin, her skin was pale from starvation, and her hands shook violently whenever she attempted to lift the standard-issue heavy combat pack. To the hardened veterans of the Iron Wolf faction, she looked like a liability, a walking corpse waiting to happen. "The wolves don't run a charity camp," Sergeant Miller had sneered, spitting dark tobacco onto the dry dirt right between her worn-out boots. "We breed apex predators. This girl? She won't last a week before the mud swallows her whole." They called her weak. They said it when she collapsed during the grueling 20-mile rucks through the freezing rain. They said it when she failed the hand-to-hand combat drills, left bruised and bleeding on the concrete floor by men twice her size. The instructors told her to pack her bags, take whatever pity money she could get, and go find a quiet place to die. But Elena had nowhere to go. The ashes of her family home were the only thing waiting for her in the outside world. The only thing keeping her heart beating, keeping her lungs expanding in the toxic air of the barracks, was a silent, terrifying rage. Instead of packing her bags, Elena found her sanctuary at the long-distance shooting range after midnight. While the rest of the camp slept off their exhaustion, Elena stood beneath the flickering, dim halogen lights. To stop her hands from trembling, she practiced holding a heavy iron bar at arm's length for 3 hours every single night. She learned the absolute science of breathing. Inhale, exhale, hold. She discovered a dark, quiet space that existed entirely between her heartbeats. That tiny, silent fraction of a second was where the bullet lived. One night, Commander Vance, the legendary scar-faced leader of the Iron Wolf faction, walked onto the range. He found her staring down the iron sights of an old, battered bolt-action rifle, her knuckles white, her uniform soaked in sweat. "Why are you still wasting my ammunition, girl?" Vance asked, his deep voice cutting through the dark like grinding stones. Elena didn't lower the rifle. She didn't even blink. She simply squeezed the trigger. A deafening crack shattered the midnight silence. A quarter-mile away, through the pitch-black darkness, a heavy steel target rang out like a bell. A perfect bullseye. Vance looked at the distant target, then looked down at the bruised, bleeding fingers of the girl. For the first time in 6 months, someone in the camp didn't look at her with disgust. Vance looked at her with cold, calculating appreciation. "Tomorrow morning, the Syndicate moves on the valley," Vance said, quietly, turning on his heel. "The loud-mouthed idiots in your barracks will likely run when the heavy mortar fire starts. If you want to prove them wrong, don't do it on paper. Do it in the blood." The next morning, the sky turned a sickening shade of black. The Syndicate launched a massive coordinated ambush, trapping the Iron Wolf vanguard inside a narrow, burning canyon. It was absolute chaos. Mortar shells tore through the convoy, flipping heavy armored transport trucks and setting them ablaze. Sergeant Miller's squad was pinned down behind a crumbling concrete wall, taking devastating fire from an unseen heavy machine gun nest positioned high on the eastern ridge. The squad's radio was a chaotic mess of screaming and static. "We're blind! We can't advance, and we can't retreat! We need heavy fire support now!" Miller roared into his radio, his face covered in soot. Suddenly, a calm, terrifyingly steady voice broke through the panic on the radio frequency. "Grid 4-2, Eastern Ridge. Give me 3 seconds." It was Elena. She hadn't retreated with the other recruits. Instead, she had climbed the highest, most exposed crane directly adjacent to a burning military truck, completely ignoring the intense heat and the thick black smoke billowing around her. She had smeared dark war paint across her cheekbones to eliminate the glare of the raging fires. Through her high-powered sniper scope, the chaotic world suddenly slowed down. The screaming of wounded men vanished. The massive explosions became nothing more than silent flashes of light. She locked her crosshairs onto the Syndicate machine gunner. He was laughing, completely exposed, raining death down upon her squad. Elena took one deep, measured breath. The wind shifted slightly to the west. She calmly turned the dial on her scope by 2 precise clicks. Inhale, exhale, hold. The rifle kicked violently against her shoulder. A heavy caliber round tore through the smoky air. A quarter-mile away, the Syndicate gunner's head snapped backward violently, his body collapsing over the parapet instantly. The devastating machine gun went dead silent. But she wasn't finished. 2 more enemy soldiers rushed forward frantically to take control of the weapon. Elena cycled the heavy bolt, a smoking casing ejected into the dirt. She chambered the next round, aimed. The rifle barked again. The second soldier dropped to the ground before his fingers could even touch the trigger mechanism. Cycled the bolt, chamber, aim. The third soldier realized what was happening and attempted to dive for cover, but Elena's third bullet caught him cleanly through the center of his chest, throwing his body completely off the rocky ridge. Down in the burning canyon, Sergeant Miller slowly lowered his weapon, staring up at the smoke-covered crane in absolute disbelief. The girl they had relentlessly mocked, the girl they claimed was too weak to survive a basic training exercise, had just eliminated the entire enemy threat in less than 10 seconds with 3 flawless shots. As the massive fuel truck directly behind her exploded into a towering wall of orange fire, illuminating the battlefield, Elena stepped out of the smoke. Her heavy rifle was held firmly in her grip, her expression completely stoic, her eyes as cold as Arctic ice. The weakness had been entirely burned away. The monster had been born. The ringing in Elena's ears didn't fade for 3 days. The explosion of the Syndicate fuel truck had left a permanent mark on the landscape of Outpost 9, a charred, blackened crater where a multi-ton transport vehicle once stood. But the explosion in the minds of the Iron Wolf mercenaries was far greater. When Elena walked down from the metal skeleton of the crane, her boots crunching against the gravel, the camp was dead silent. The frantic shouting over the comms had ceased. The panic had evaporated, replaced by a heavy, suffocating awe. Sergeant Miller stood by the wreckage of his command vehicle, his face smeared with soot and his tactical vest torn. He didn't spit tobacco this time. He didn't laugh. As Elena approached, his hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, not out of aggression, but out of a raw, primal defensive reflex. He looked at her the way a man looks at a wild predator that has unexpectedly chosen not to bite. "Where did you learn to shoot like that, recruit?" Miller's voice was stripped of its usual mocking arrogance. It was hollow, exhausted, and deeply unsettled. Elena didn't stop walking. She didn't look him in the eye. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her battered bolt-action rifle slung tightly across her shoulder. "I didn't learn," she said, her voice a quiet, flat monotone that chilled the air more than the mountain wind. "I survived." Behind her, the remaining men of the vanguard watched her pass in absolute silence. The hierarchy of the camp had been shattered in less than 10 seconds. The girl they had left behind in the mud during the rucks, the girl they had assigned to clean the grease traps in the mess hall, had just saved 43 battle-hardened mercenaries with 3 pieces of lead. By nightfall, the rumors had spread through the entire Iron Wolf private military compound. Some said she was a genetically modified asset from the old government programs. Others claimed she was possessed by the spirits of her slaughtered village. But Commander Vance knew the truth. He knew that the most dangerous weapon in the world wasn't technology or magic. It was a human being with absolutely nothing left to lose, fueled by a singular, hyper-focused obsession. Midnight found Elena back at the long-distance range, exactly where Vance had left her the night before. But the old, battered training rifle was gone. Resting on the steel bench before her was a heavy, matte black hard case bearing the silver crest of the Iron Wolf command tier. Vance stepped out from the shadows of the observation tower, the glowing ember of his cigar illuminating the deep scars on his weathered face. "Open it," Vance commanded. Elena unlatched the heavy polymer clips. The lid swung open to reveal a pristine, custom-engineered Blackwood 50 caliber anti-material system. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, a heavy, free-floating match-grade barrel, an advanced hydraulic recoil mitigation stock, and a thermographic variable zoom optic that looked like it belonged on a fighter jet rather than a small arm. The rifle looked completely lethal, cold and flawless. "This belonged to Master Sniper Kalen," Vance said, his eyes tracking Elena's hands as they hovered over the weapon. "He was the best we had. 2 months ago, a Syndicate counter-sniper took his left eye and his trigger finger in the eastern swamps. He's alive, but his war is over. He told me to give this to the first person who proved they had the stomach to carry it. I thought it would sit in my vault for a decade. I was wrong." Elena didn't touch the rifle immediately. She looked at the polished steel of the bolt, her own reflection staring back at her through the dark metal. "I don't need a fancy weapon to kill them," she whispered. "No, you don't," Vance countered, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "But you need a weapon that can survive where I am sending you. 3 shots from a crane doesn't make you a sniper, Elena. It makes you lucky. The Syndicate knows someone broke their line at Outpost 9. They are already adapting. If you want to hunt the men who burned your world, you need to learn the actual science of death. Tomorrow at dawn, a transport leaves for the ghost cage." Elena looked up, her dark eyes locking on to Vance's gaze. The ghost cage was the stuff of legends and nightmares within the PMC. It wasn't a training camp, it was a meat grinder designed to break the psychological barriers of human soldiers, turning them into cold, unfeeling executioners who could sit in frozen mud for a week just to pull a trigger once. "I'll be on the transport," Elena said simply. The training grounds of the ghost cage were located deep within the jagged, perpetually frozen peaks of the northern ridge. The air here was thin, cutting into the lungs like broken glass. There were no barracks, no hot meals, and no camaraderie. There were only 7 candidates, chosen from the elite ranks of the Iron Wolf military branches, and 1 instructor. Master Sniper Kalen stood before them on the snow-covered tarmac. A thick leather patch covered his left eye, and his right hand was wrapped in heavy tactical tape to conceal the missing digits. Despite his crippling injuries, he stood straight as a spear, surrounded by an aura of absolute authority. "Look at the person to your left," Kalen roared, his voice cutting through the freezing gale. "Now look to your right. By the end of the first week, 2 of them will be dead from hypothermia. By the end of the month, 3 more will have quit, their minds completely broken by the isolation. The Iron Wolves do not want marksmen. A computer can calculate wind age. A drone can drop a bomb. We want ghosts. We want individuals who can dissolve into the environment, who can become invisible, and who can make the enemy believe that the very air they breathe is trying to kill them. Kalen walked down the line of candidates, stopped directly in front of Elena, and stared down at her with his single, piercing eye. He looked at her small frame, her pale face, and the custom Blackwood 5.0 caliber rifle slung over her shoulder. Kalen's weapon, the instructor muttered, a bitter smile crossing his scarred lips. The girl who took 3 lucky shots at the Outpost thinks she can carry the weight of a legend. Tell me, girl, what is the weight of a human life? Elena looked up, her expression entirely unreadable. Varies by the caliber, she replied coldly. The other candidates gasped softly, expecting Kalen to strike her down for the insolence. Instead, the veteran sniper burst into a loud, barking laugh that echoed across the frozen peaks. "We will see, Recruit 404, Kalen whispered, his face inches from hers. "We will see how clever you are when the mountains start eating your soul." The training began instantly, and it was a descent into a specialized kind of hell. The first phase wasn't even about shooting, it was about disappearances. Elena and the other candidates were given 24 hours to construct a ghillie suit entirely from scratch, using nothing but raw burlap, local vegetation, and the dirt beneath their feet. They were then dropped into a 5-square-mile valley of jagged rocks and dead brush. Kalen and a team of seasoned spotters sat on the high ridges with high-powered thermal optics and high-magnification binoculars. The objective was simple: advance 2 miles across the open, exposed valley, set up a firing position within 300 yards of Kalen's observation post, and take a dry-fire shot at a designated target without being detected. If a candidate was spotted, they were immediately disqualified and sent back to the regular infantry lines in disgrace. The first candidate, a massive, decorated scout from the Heavy Recon Division, relied on speed. He utilized the low gullies and tried to move rapidly between boulders. Within 20 minutes, Kalen's voice boomed over the valley speakers. "Candidate 1, your silhouette broke the horizon line at grid 37. You're dead. Pack your bags." The second candidate tried to blend into a patch of dense brush, but he failed to account for the shifting angle of the sun. As the afternoon progressed, his shadow extended across the white snow, a perfect, unnatural black line that betrayed his position. "Candidate 2, your shadow just gave away your entire squad," Kalen's voice droned. "Disqualified." Elena didn't move fast, and she didn't choose the obvious cover. She spent the first 6 hours doing absolutely nothing but observing the wind and the snow. She realized that the valley wasn't static, it was constantly moving. The wind created ripples in the snow, and the dead brush swayed in a specific rhythmic cadence. She crawled on her stomach, moving at a pace that was agonizingly slow, less than 3 feet every 10 minutes. She didn't just wear her camouflage, she became part of the terrain. When she moved through a patch of gray mud, she coated her entire face and rifle barrel in the freezing sludge to match the exact texture and reflectivity of the earth. When the wind blew hard, kicking up flurries of white powder, she advanced. When the wind died down, she froze, becoming as completely motionless as a boulder. Her core body temperature dropped dangerously low. Her fingers lost all sensation, and the frost began to form on her eyelashes. Her internal demons began to scream. In the absolute silence of the mountain, she could hear the screams of her mother from the night her village was burned. She could see the mocking faces of the mercenaries at the camp. "You are weak," the voices whispered in her mind. "You are just a little girl freezing to death in the mountains. You should have died with the others." Elena clamped her jaw shut until her teeth cracked. She forced the trauma down into the same dark, quiet chamber where she kept her breath. She didn't let the emotion panic her heart. A fast heartbeat meant shaking hands. Shaking hands meant a vibrating rifle. A vibrating rifle meant death. 18 hours into the exercise, the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic crimson shadows across the valley. Kalen and his spotters swept the terrain with their high-powered thermal scopes, looking for the telltale heat signature of a human body. They found nothing. The valley appeared entirely empty. "All candidates have likely failed or frozen," one of the spotters muttered, lowering his binoculars. "The girl is probably dead in a ditch somewhere." Kalen didn't answer. He picked up his own radio, his single eye scanning the immediate perimeter of his observation post. "Recruit 404, if you are out there, the exercise is over. Come in." Silence. Suddenly, a tiny patch of gray, mud-covered snow exactly 12 feet in front of Kalen's observation platform began to shift. It didn't look like a human rising. It looked like the earth itself was opening up. Elena rose from the frozen ground. She was completely unrecognizable. She had buried herself beneath 3 inches of freezing mud and snow, using a hollow reed to breathe through for 6 consecutive hours. Her body heat had been completely masked by the thick layer of packed earth above her, making her entirely invisible to the multi-million-dollar thermal sensors. She stood there, her body shivering violently, but her custom Blackwood rifle was raised, aimed directly at Kalen's forehead. Kalen looked down the barrel of the weapon, then looked at the girl's hollow, dead eyes. A cold sweat broke on the back of the veteran's neck. He realized that if this had been a real combat scenario, he would have been dead hours ago, and he would have never even known who killed him. "Pass," Kalen whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "God help the Syndicate." The second phase of the ghost cage was the entry into the cold, clinical reality of advanced ballistics. For 2 weeks, Elena didn't touch a bullet. She sat in a dark room with a pencil and a notebook, learning that long-range shooting wasn't an art form, it was an exact mathematical equation. Kalen stood at a blackboard, drawing complex geometric formulas that looked more like advanced physics equations than military instruction. At 1,000 yards, a standard .50 caliber round is affected by things the average soldier doesn't even know exist, Kalen explained, tapping the board with a wooden pointer. You must calculate the Coriolis effect, the actual rotation of the Earth while the bullet is in midair. If you shoot north in the northern hemisphere, the Earth rotates beneath your bullet, causing it to drift to the right. If you fail to calculate the rotation of the planet, you miss by 3 feet. The Earth itself will protect your target if you are ignorant. He turned to Elena, his single eye narrowing. Then there is aerodynamic jump. If you have a crosswind from the left, it doesn't just push the bullet right, it actually forces the nose of the projectile upward, altering your vertical trajectory. You must calculate the air density, the barometric pressure, the altitude, and the core temperature of your powder. A hot bullet flies faster than a cold bullet. Elena absorbed the data like a sponge. Her mind, stripped of all personal identity and emotional connection, found comfort in the cold, unyielding certainty of numbers. People lied. People betrayed you. People called you weak and left you to die in the ashes. But mathematics never lied. Gravity was absolute. The wind was a variable that could be quantified. She spent hours calculating complex firing solutions in her head. Kalen would bark out random scenarios while she was performing intensive physical training. 2,000 meters, altitude 5,000 feet, crosswind 15 knots from 3 o'clock, target moving at 4 miles per hour from left to right. Give me the elevation and windage adjustments now. Kalen would scream while Elena was holding a grueling plank position in the freezing snow. 32 clicks up, 7 clicks left, hold 2 inches high for aerodynamic jump. Elena would yell back, her core muscles screaming with agony, her face buried in the ice. Correct, again. They pushed her to the absolute limit of human endurance. They forced her to shoot with a high heart rate, forcing her to sprint a mile, then instantly drop into a shooting position and engage 5 targets at varying distances in less than 20 seconds. She learned to use the rhythm of her pulse to her advantage, squeezing the trigger precisely in the microscopic pause between her heartbeats, ensuring that the movement of her arteries didn't deflect the path of the bullet. By the end of the month, the 7 candidates had been reduced to just 2, Elena and a ruthless mercenary named Boris, a former Special Forces operator from the Eastern Bloc who possessed a violent streak and an unblemished record of high-value assassinations. Boris was a machine of muscle and aggression. Elena was a shadow of bone and focus. They represented 2 entirely different philosophies of warfare. Boris killed to dominate. Elena killed to balance a ledger. "The final test is tomorrow," Kalen announced to the 2 remaining candidates on a bitter, moonless night. "The Syndicate has established a high-security communications array in the Devil's Throat Pass. The facility is protected by a state-of-the-art counter-sniper radar system and an elite platoon of corporate guards. This isn't a training exercise anymore. This is a live-fire combat operation. The candidate who eliminates the Syndicate commander and destroys the array wins the title of Iron Wolf's lead sniper. The loser, well, the loser won't be coming back." The Devil's Throat was a jagged vertical fissure that sliced through the heart of the northern mountains. The sides of the canyon were sheer rock walls that rose thousands of feet into the sky, creating a natural wind tunnel that made long-range ballistics nearly impossible. The wind didn't just blow in one direction, it swirled, creating unpredictable, violent vortexes that could catch a heavy bullet and fling it 50 feet off course. Elena and Boris were deployed on opposite sides of the canyon ridge, separated by an abyss of freezing fog and a distance of 1.5 miles. Below them, nestled in the absolute base of the canyon, was the Syndicate communications compound. It was heavily fortified, surrounded by layers of razor wire, automated machine gun turrets, and patrols of heavily armored mercenaries wearing digital camouflage. Through her high-powered thermographic scope, Elena watched the compound come to life. The target was General Eyrie, a high-ranking Syndicate commander known for his brutal pacification campaigns in the border provinces. He was a massive man, protected by a personal bodyguard of 4 heavy shield bearers and a constant umbrella of electronic countermeasures. "I have eyes on the target," Boris's voice crackled over the secure squad radio frequency. He sounded confident, almost bored. "Distance is 1,700 meters. The wind is a mess, but my heavy weapon can punch straight through the vortex. I'm taking the shot in 60 seconds. Elena didn't answer. She was analyzing the environment. She noticed something that Boris, in his eagerness to claim the kill, had completely overlooked. The Syndicate had deployed a Gorgon counter-sniper detection array on the central roof of the facility. It was a highly sensitive acoustic and laser radar system that could analyze the trajectory of a bullet in real time, instantly calculating the exact GPS coordinates of the shooter and directing the automated heavy mortars to obliterate that position within 4 seconds of a shot being fired. If Boris pulled his trigger, his bullet might hit the target, but the automated counter-artillery would wipe his entire ridge off the map before his spent casing hit the dirt. "Boris, hold your fire," Elena said, her voice calm and urgent. "The Gorgon array is active on the central roof. If you shoot, you trigger an immediate automated mortar strike on your position."
"Shut up, recruit," Boris snarled back, his pride wounded by her interference. "You're just trying to steal my kill because you're terrified of the distance. Watch a real professional work." Through her scope, Elena saw the muzzle flash of Boris's heavy rifle from across the canyon. A split second later, the heavy bullet tore through the air, but the chaotic wind vortex inside the Devil's Throat caught the projectile, deflecting it by 4 feet. The round missed General Eyrie's head, slamming instead into the armored shoulder of his primary bodyguard. The compound erupted into absolute chaos. Sirens wailed, and the automated turrets spun around, searching for the threat. At the exact same instant, the Gorgon detection array on the roof spun to the north, its red laser sensors locking onto the exact ridge where Boris was concealed. The automated mortar tubes on the perimeter walls adjusted instantly, their mechanical gears whining as they aimed into the sky. "Boris, move!" Elena yelled. It was too late. A barrage of high-explosive mortar shells screamed through the dark, raining down on Boris's position with terrifying precision. The entire ridge opposite Elena exploded into a cataclysm of fire, shattered rock, and white smoke. Boris's radio line went completely dead, replaced by the crackle of burning static. The other candidates had been right about one thing: the ghost cage didn't forgive mistakes. Elena was completely alone. The entire Syndicate compound was now on high alert. General Eyrie was being rushed by his remaining guards toward an armored transport vehicle parked beneath a heavy concrete canopy. The automated searchlights began to sweep the ridges, their brilliant white beams cutting through the freezing fog, searching for a second shooter. To make matters worse, the Syndicate's own elite counter-sniper, a nameless killer known only as the Nomad, had just taken up a position somewhere on the facility's high observation towers. Suddenly, a high-velocity bullet tore through the air, grazing the rocky outcrop just 3 inches above Elena's head. The impact showered her face with sharp splinters of stone and burning dust. The Nomad had found her. Elena didn't panic. She didn't drop her weapon or run for cover. She forced her body to become entirely rigid, melting back into her custom ghillie suit, blending perfectly with the gray mud and the frozen shale of her ridge. She stopped breathing entirely. "Where is he?" she asked herself, her mind working with the speed of a quantum computer. She didn't look through her scope. That would create a lens flare that the enemy sniper could see. Instead, she used her naked eye, searching for the tiny, microscopic anomalies in the environment. She looked for the breath of a human being in the freezing air. She looked for the faint, unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel among the chaotic, jagged shapes of the industrial facility below. Another bullet smacked past her ear, so close she could feel the vacuum of its wake. The Nomad was adjusting his aim. The next shot would find her skull. Then she saw it. A tiny, rhythmic puff of white vapor rising from behind a heavy air conditioning unit on the 3rd-floor balcony of the main building. It was a human breath, appearing once every 4 seconds. The Nomad was an exceptional killer, but he had failed to control his core temperature. In the freezing cold of the Devil's Throat, his own lungs were betraying his position. Elena slowly aligned her Blackwood 50 caliber rifle. The distance was exactly 1,850 meters, over a mile of unpredictable swirling wind vortexes. The angle was a steep downward slope of 45 degrees. She looked at her scope's wind age dial. The wind was gusting violently from the left, then suddenly dropping to absolute 0 before swirling back to the right. It was a chaotic system. A standard calculation was completely useless here. She remembered Kalen's words: "You must find the space between the chaos." Elena didn't look at the wind flags. She looked at the smoke rising from the burning wreckage of the transport trucks below. The smoke was twisting into a specific spiral shape. It was a natural indicator of the vortex's rotation. She adjusted her elevation dial, 38 clicks up. She adjusted her wind age dial, 12 clicks to the left. She held the crosshairs not on the Nomad's head, but 3 feet to the left and 2 feet above him, trusting the chaotic air currents to drag the heavy bullet exactly where it needed to go. Her heart rate slowed. 90 beats per minute. 80. 70. 60. Inhale. Exhale. Hold. The space between her heartbeats arrived. The world became a silent, frozen photograph. She squeezed the trigger. The Blackwood rifle let out a thunderous roar that echoed through the canyon like a crack of thunder.
The massive hydraulic recoil system pushed against her shoulder, absorbing the violent energy. For 2 full seconds, the bullet was in flight, slicing through the freezing fog, fighting the swirling vortexes, spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. 2 miles away, the Nomad was just about to pull his own trigger. The heavy .50 caliber match-grade round tore straight through the heavy air conditioning unit, shattering the steel casing, and struck the enemy sniper directly through the center of his chest, completely throwing his body over the balcony railing. He fell 3 stories down into the courtyard below, dead before his body hit the concrete. The enemy counter-sniper was eliminated, but Elena wasn't finished. General Eyrie was just inches away from the open door of his heavily armored transport vehicle. If he stepped inside that vehicle, the bulletproof plating would protect him from any small arm in existence, and he would escape to fight another day. Elena cycled her rifle's bolt with an alpha-level fluid motion. A massive, smoking brass casing flew out of the chamber, cutting a clean arc through the freezing air before landing silently in the snow. She chambered the final round, a specialized tungsten-core armor-piercing incendiary projectile. She didn't aim for Eyrie. He was moving too fast, surrounded by his remaining shield-bearers. Instead, she locked her crosshairs onto the massive, exposed high-pressure fuel reservoir tank located directly adjacent to the transport vehicle. The distance was 1,900 meters. The wind was still howling. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't need to calculate anymore. The mathematics had become part of her muscle memory. She was no longer a human being operating a machine. She was the machine itself. Crack! The tungsten round tore through the canyon air, striking the high-pressure fuel valve with millimeter precision. A bright flash of white sparks erupted as the armor-piercing core shattered the thick steel pipe. A split second later, the highly pressurized fuel sprayed out across the courtyard, instantly igniting against the hot exhaust of the transport vehicle's engine. A catastrophic, blinding explosion tore through the base of the canyon. A massive, roaring wall of orange and yellow fire that reached hundreds of feet into the air, completely consuming the transport vehicle, General Eyrie, his shield-bearers, and the entire communications array in a single devastating heartbeat. It looked exactly like the thumbnail of her own legend, a towering inferno of absolute destruction, with the shadow of death looking down from above. Elena slowly lowered her rifle, the barrel smoking in the freezing air. She stood up from the mud, her face completely stoic, her war paint smudged with the ash of the distant explosion. Through the radio static, Kalen's voice finally returned. He'd been watching the entire engagement through a satellite link from the command bunker. Outpost 9 was a fluke, Kalen said, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded remarkably like reverence. But this was a masterpiece. Welcome to the elite tier, Elena. You are no longer a recruit. You are the Iron Wolf's ghost. The girl they had called weak, the girl they had left behind to die in the mud, had just dismantled an entire Syndicate command structure with 2 bullets from a mile away. The weakness was gone, buried forever beneath the snow of the northern peaks. The legend of the deadliest sniper had officially begun. The transition from the frozen hell of the northern peaks to the suffocating neon-drenched humidity of Sector 7 was a shock to the system for most soldiers. But Elena didn't have a system anymore. She had a purpose. The successful elimination of General Eyrie at the Devil's Throat had sent shockwaves through the Syndicate's upper echelons. For months, they believed the Iron Wolf PMC was a corporate mercenary outfit that could be bought, bullied, or broken. Now their high-ranking officers were refusing deployments to open-air sectors. They were hiding inside reinforced concrete bunkers, terrified of the open sky. They were terrified of the ghost. Inside the briefing room of the Iron Wolf flagship, the Leviathan, floating 3 miles off the coast of the tropical war zone, the air conditioning hummed a low metallic tune. Commander Vance stood before a massive holographic map of Sector 7,
a sprawling, semi-submerged coastal megacity that had become the primary logistics hub for the Syndicate's illegal weapons trade. "You've earned your teeth, Elena," Vance said, his single good eye reflecting the cold blue light of the hologram. "But the war isn't won. The man who orchestrated the clearing of your home province wasn't Eyrie. He was just the blunt instrument. The mind behind the slaughter is this man." The hologram shifted, displaying a razor-sharp digital profile of Commander Victor Cross. Cross was a former state intelligence director who had defected to the Syndicate, bringing with him an entire division of Black Ops specialists. He was a master of asymmetrical warfare, a man who viewed human populations as mere numbers on a spreadsheet. "Cross is currently stationed inside the Sunken district," Vance continued, zooming the map into a labyrinth of decaying skyscrapers, flooded avenues, and rusted shipping containers. "He knows we're coming for him. He has transformed the central financial tower into an absolute fortress. The structural glass is reinforced with carbon nanotube mesh, impervious to standard high-caliber rounds. The surrounding waters are patrolled by automated gunboats, and the roofs are packed with anti-air arrays. A conventional assault would cost us half our army." Elena stood in the corner of the room, her physical form nearly lost in the shadows. She wore her new adaptive urban camouflage suit, a lightweight matrix of fiber-optic tiles that could subtly shift color tones to match the environment. Her Blackwood .5 caliber rifle rested in its custom scabbard on her back, the barrel clean, the mechanism oiled to absolute perfection. "He has to look out a window eventually," Elena said, her voice completely devoid of inflection. "It's not that simple anymore," Vance warned, tapping a command key. "Cross has deployed a localized Aegis electronic warfare dome across the entire sector. The moment any projectile traveling over 500 meters per second enters that airspace, the localized radar system detects the air displacement. The system instantly deploys heavy automated steel shutters over every window in the tower. You cannot shoot him through the glass, because the glass won't be there by the time the bullet arrives. The machine reacts faster than the speed of sound." Elena looked at the digital blueprint of the tower. She didn't see an impossible defense. She saw a mathematical puzzle that simply hadn't been solved yet. "Then I won't shoot him from the outside," Elena whispered, her eyes locking onto the flooded, dark tunnels beneath the structure. The insertion into Sector 7 was executed at 0200 hours under the cover of a massive tropical monsoon. The rain fell in heavy, violent sheets, obliterating all visibility and creating a deafening acoustic mask that drowned out the sound of Elena's deployment. She slipped into the black, oil-slicked waters of the Sunken district from a low-profile stealth Zodiac. The water was warm, thick with the stench of decomposing garbage, industrial chemicals, and old rust. Swimming through the flooded avenues of a dead metropolis was entirely different from crawling through the mountain snow, but the core principles of the ghost cage remained absolute. Become the environment. Do not fight it. Elena swam beneath the surface using a specialized closed-circuit rebreather that produced 0 bubbles. Above her, the hulls of Syndicate patrol boats sliced through the water, their powerful searchlights cutting through the murky depths like long, pale fingers. She timed her movements perfectly, drifting along the rusted undercarriages of sunken city buses and submerged vehicles, completely invisible to both human eyes and automated sonar sweeps. After 3 hours of agonizingly slow aquatic infiltration, she reached her staging point, the flooded basement of an abandoned department store located exactly 1,200 meters from Cross's command tower. Elena emerged from the black water like a phantom. She didn't shake the water from her gear. She didn't complain about the suffocating 90% humidity that caused her uniform to cling to her skin. She immediately went to work, preparing her firing position.
The department store was a hollowed-out concrete shell, its interior walls collapsed and its windows long since shattered by artillery fire. Elena crawled up the rotting escalator bank to the third floor, selecting a deep, dark corner behind a collapsed concrete pillar. This wasn't a standard sniper nest. She didn't clear the debris away. She left the dust and the spiderwebs exactly as they were. She created a microscopic viewing port, a hole no larger than a tennis ball, through a cracked piece of drywall. From this position, she had a clear, unobstructed line of sight across the plaza directly into the upper executive suites of the Syndicate command tower. She unslung the Blackwood .50 caliber. The humidity of the sector was a major variable. High humidity meant the air was less dense because water vapor molecules are lighter than nitrogen and oxygen molecules. Less dense air meant less aerodynamic drag on the bullet. Elena opened her tactical notebook, her fingers moving with clinical precision. At 1,200 meters in 95% humidity and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, her bullet would fly flatter and faster than it did in the freezing, thin air of the northern peaks. She would have to adjust her elevation dial down by 4 clicks to prevent the round from sailing clean over Cross's head. She settled into the prone position, her body molding into the wet concrete floor. The monsoon outside showed no signs of stopping. The rain slammed against the metal roof above her, a relentless, hypnotic rhythm that would have driven an ordinary person mad with isolation. But to Elena, the rain was a symphony. It was the sound of her cover. By dawn, the monsoon had settled into a steady, gray drizzle. The Sunken district woke up to the sound of heavy machinery and military boots. From her microscopic viewing port, Elena watched the Syndicate forces prepare for a routine patrol rotation. The plaza below her position was a death trap. It was heavily mined with acoustic vibration sensors and protected by 3 separate sniper teams stationed on the surrounding rooftops. If Elena pulled her trigger, the sound of the .50 caliber round, even with the monsoon rain, would instantly betray her general direction to the enemy counter-snipers. She needed to clear the board before she could take her shot at the king. Through her thermographic variable zoom optic, Elena locked onto the first enemy sniper team located on the roof of a flooded bank building 700 meters to her left. The team consisted of a shooter and a spotter, both equipped with advanced digital camouflage capes and a high-resolution laser rangefinder. "Spotter is the priority," Elena murmured to herself, her voice a silent breath against the stock of her rifle. In long-range engagement, the spotter is always the true brain of the sniper team. They calculate the wind, read the Mirage, and direct the shooter's fire. If you kill the shooter first, the spotter will instantly locate your muzzle flash and provide an exact counter-firing solution to the rest of the network. If you kill the spotter first, the shooter is left blind, paralyzed by panic. Elena adjusted her scope for 700 meters. The wind in the urban canyons was erratic, bouncing off the vertical glass faces of the skyscrapers, creating unpredictable microbursts of lateral air currents. She watched the trash floating in the flooded plaza below. It was drifting slowly to the east, but the smoke from a burning barrel on the bank roof was blowing violently to the west. 2 conflicting wind systems in the same flight path, a double vortex. Elena closed her eyes for 3 seconds, letting her auditory senses take over. She listened to the pitch of the wind howling through the cracked windows of her own building. The pitch was high, indicating a velocity of roughly 12 knots at her position. She opened her eyes, dialed in 6 clicks left, and held the crosshairs directly on the spotter's throat. Inhale. Exhale. Hold. She didn't squeeze the trigger immediately. She waited for a natural acoustic spike. Down in the plaza, a heavy Syndicate transport truck suffered a catastrophic tire blowout due to the sharp structural debris in the water.
a loud, metallic bang that echoed through the concrete canyon. At that exact millisecond, Elena pulled the trigger. The Blackwood rifle barked, its sound perfectly masked by the violent explosion of the truck tire. 700 meters away, the Syndicate spotter's head snapped sideways as the heavy-caliber bullet tore through his neck, destroying his vocal cords and severing his spine instantly. He collapsed into the gravel of the roof without making a single sound. The shooter didn't even notice at first. He was still staring through his optic, waiting for his partner to give him a wind adjustment. It took him 5 full seconds to realize that the liquid pooling around his boots wasn't rainwater, but the dark crimson blood of his comrade. By the time panic set in and the enemy shooter began to turn his head, Elena had already cycled the heavy bolt, chambered a second round, and adjusted her aim by 2 millimeters. Crack! The second bullet struck the enemy sniper directly through the center of his optic lens, shattering the glass and driving the metallic fragments deep into his skull. He dropped instantly, his rifle slipping from his fingers and clattering into the flooded street below. 1 team down, 2 remaining. Elena spent the next 4 hours systematically dismantling the Syndicate's defensive perimeter. She didn't rush. She waited for lightning strikes, for mortar test fires, and for the heavy revving of marine engines to mask the sound of her weapon. She killed with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of a virus, leaving 6 elite Syndicate marksmen dead on their perches without ever triggering a single alarm or revealing a hint of her presence. The sky began to clear. The trap was set. Now she just needed the target. At 1400 hours, the steel shutters on the executive floor of the command tower finally slid open. Commander Victor Cross stepped out onto the glass-enclosed balcony, surrounded by 3 heavily armored advisors. Cross was exactly as he appeared in the briefings, arrogant, immaculate, and completely confident in his absolute security. He held a digital tablet in his hand, pointing toward the southern shipping lanes, completely oblivious to the fact that over a mile away, a girl he had left for dead was looking directly at the space between his eyes. Elena's heart rate remained at a perfectly steady 55 beats per minute. She aligned her crosshairs with Cross's forehead. The distance was exactly 1,240 meters, but she didn't pull the trigger. She knew about the Aegis system. If she fired a standard round, the bullet would travel at roughly 900 meters per second. The moment it crossed the perimeter line at the 1,000-meter mark, the Aegis radar would detect the supersonic shockwave. The automated steel shutters on Cross's balcony would slam shut in less than 0.2 seconds. The bullet would slam uselessly into 4 inches of reinforced military-grade titanium armor plating, and Cross would escape into the core of the building. The machine was faster than the bullet. To beat the machine, Elena had to change the math. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a highly specialized, custom-engineered cartridge that Kalen had handed her before she left the ghost cage, a subsonic, heavy-grain, solid copper projectile. This bullet was massive, weighing nearly twice as much as a standard .50 caliber round, but it was packed with a significantly smaller powder charge. When fired, the bullet would travel at just 310 meters per second, just below the speed of sound. Because it was subsonic, the bullet would not produce a sonic boom. It would not create the violent air displacement that the Aegis electronic warfare dome was programmed to detect. To the automated radar system, the bullet would look like nothing more than a heavy raindrop or a stray bird drifting through the storm. But there was a devastating trade-off. Because the bullet was traveling so slowly, it would be heavily affected by gravity. The drop would be cataclysmic. While a standard round would drop roughly 20 feet over that distance, the subsonic heavy projectile would drop an astonishing 85 feet before reaching the target. It wouldn't fly like a laser, it would fly like an artillery shell, traveling in a massive, dramatic arc high into the sky before plunging straight down toward the earth. Elena looked at her elevation dial. She had to turn the knob through its entire rotation, adjusting it by over 80 clicks up. She was no longer aiming at the window. Through her scope, she was aiming at an empty patch of gray sky 3 stories above the command tower. She was shooting blind, thrusting the physics completely.
"You built a machine to catch a bullet," Elena whispered, her fingers slowly settling onto the cold steel of the trigger. "But you didn't build a machine to catch the rain." The wind shifted again, a sudden, violent gust from the north that threatened to throw the heavy, slow-moving projectile completely off course. Elena held her breath, waiting for the precise second where the wind velocity dropped into a predictable, steady cross-drift. Inhale, exhale, hold. The space arrived. She squeezed. The sound of the subsonic round firing was completely different from her previous shots. It wasn't a sharp, deafening crack. It was a heavy, muffled thump that barely shook the dust from the drywall around her. The massive copper projectile exited the barrel, immediately curving upward into the gray, misty sky. It climbed higher and higher, leaving no visible vapor trail, cutting through the heavy tropical moisture silently. For 4 full seconds, the bullet was in the air. To a spectator, it would have seemed like nothing was happening. Cross was still standing on his balcony, gesturing toward his tablet, laughing at a comment made by one of his advisors. The automated Aegis radar dishes on the roof continued to spin, their electronic eyes scanning the horizon for supersonic threats, completely ignoring the heavy piece of copper that was currently descending from the clouds directly above them. The bullet reached the apex of its arc and began its steep vertical plunge. Elena didn't look away from her scope. She watched Cross's face through the crosshairs, her vision unblinking, her mind counting the milliseconds. 3, 2, 1. The subsonic projectile tore through the thin fabric roof of the balcony canopy, completely silent, and struck Commander Victor Cross directly through the crown of his skull. The impact was devastating. The heavy, solid copper round expanded instantly upon impact, transferring all of its massive kinetic energy directly into his upper torso. Cross dropped to the glass floor like a stone, his digital tablet shattering into 1,000 pieces. The advisors stood frozen in absolute, paralyzed horror. There had been no sound of a gunshot. There had been no warning siren from the multi-million-dollar Aegis defense system. The heavy steel armor shutters remained wide open, completely useless against a threat they didn't even know existed. To the men standing on that balcony, it looked as though the hand of God had simply reached down from the sky and struck their commander dead. The plaza below erupted into instant, uncoordinated chaos. Syndicate soldiers began running in every direction, their vehicles revving their engines, their automated turrets spinning wildly as they fired blind barrages into the surrounding empty buildings. But Elena was already gone. The moment the bullet left her barrel, before it had even reached the apex of its flight path, Elena had unslung her rifle, packed her notebook, and slid down the collapsed escalator shaft into the black waters of the department store. She didn't stay to watch her victory. A true sniper doesn't need to see the target fall. The mathematics ensure the conclusion long before the blood hits the floor. She swam back through the dark, flooded tunnels of the Sunken district, using the same silent rebreather, completely bypassed the frantic, panicked sonar sweeps of the Syndicate patrol boats above. They were searching for a military vanguard, an army, a supersonic missile. They didn't know how to look for a shadow. 6 hours later, Elena climbed onto the metal deck of the Iron Wolf flagship, the Leviathan. Her adaptive camouflage suit was stained with oil and mud, her blonde hair soaked with tropical rain, and her face smeared with the smudged black war paint that had become her signature mark. Commander Vance met her at the gantry, a quiet, profound respect in his eyes. He held a glass of water out to her, which she took without a word. "Cross is confirmed dead," Vance said, his voice low. "The Syndicate logistics network in Sector 7 is completely paralyzed. Their officers are evacuating the city as we speak. You didn't just kill a commander today, Elena. You broke their spirit." Elena took a single sip of the water, then handed the glass back to him. She unslung her blackwood rifle and began to clean the saltwater moisture from the bolt assembly with a soft cloth. "The ledger isn't balanced yet," she said, her voice as cold and dark as the ocean depths she had just emerged from.
Who is next? Vance looked at the young woman before him. The shivering, terrified girl from the border provinces was completely gone, buried so deep beneath layers of steel, mathematics, and cold blood that she could never be recovered. In her place stood the ultimate weapon, a specter of vengeance that wouldn't stop until the entire Syndicate organization was nothing but ashes and bone. The hunt was far from over. The Syndicate had one remaining stronghold, the impenetrable high-altitude mountain fortress known as the Eyrie, and it was there that the final true mastermind of the war was waiting for her. The air at 14,000 feet did not support life, it merely tolerated it. The Eyrie was not just a fortress, it was a psychological statement. Carved directly into the jagged basalt crown of the Razorback Mountains, the Syndicate's ultimate stronghold looked down upon the clouds like an angry god of iron and concrete. There were no roads leading to the summit. There were no hidden paths through the cliffs. The only traditional point of entry was a heavily fortified suspension bridge suspended over a 3,000-foot drop, guarded by automated twin-rotor autocannons and biometric checkpoints. To the strategic planners of the Iron Wolf PMC, an assault on the Eyrie was considered an impossibility. A single squad attempting to cross the bridge would be vaporized in seconds. An airborne drop via helicopter or drone would be detected by the long-range radar arrays 50 miles before arrival and blown out of the sky by surface-to-air missiles. But Elena did not use bridges, and she did not fly. She climbed. She began her ascent at midnight at the absolute base of the mountain's western face, a sheer vertical wall of black ice and unstable shale known to local mountaineers as the Dead Face. The temperature hovered at a brutal 20 degrees below zero. The wind screamed down the rock chimney like a freight train, threatening to rip anyone off the stone who dared to challenge its domain. Elena wore no heavy climbing ropes, no metal pitons to hammer into the rock, and no mechanical ascenders. The sound of a metal hammer hitting stone would ring through the mountain like a bell, alerting the acoustic sensors embedded in the fortress walls above. Instead, she relied entirely on her own physical transformation. Her hands, once mocked for their trembling weakness in the early days of recruit training, were now encased in specialized high-friction tactical gloves lined with microsynthetic climbing fibers. Her core muscles, forged through the torturous physical conditioning of the ghost cage, held her body perfectly parallel to the freezing rock face. On her back, she carried the heavy matte black hard case containing her Blackwood 50 caliber anti-material system. The weapon weighed over 30 pounds, a crushing burden that felt like an anvil pulling her toward the abyss below. Inhale, exhale, move. The rhythm was her life. She reached up, her fingers finding a microscopic fissure in the frozen basalt. She pulled her body upward, her boots finding a tiny ledge of black ice no wider than a coin. She did not look down. Below her lay nothing but a swirling void of white fog and certain death. Every muscle in her back screamed with absolute agony. The thin air deprived her blood of oxygen, causing her brain to throb with a vicious rhythmic headache. The trauma of her past began to claw its way to the surface again. She could see the burning timbers of her childhood home dancing in the shadows of the rock formations. She could hear the cruel laughter of the Syndicate soldiers as they systematically executed her neighbors. "Let it burn," she told herself, her jaw locked so tightly that her gums bled. Let the fire warm the cold. She did not suppress the anger anymore. She used it as fuel. Every ounce of pain was directed into her fingers, locking them onto the stone with unbreakable force. She was no longer a girl climbing a mountain. She was a specter of absolute vengeance crawling out of the grave to claim what was owed. 6 hours into the vertical climb, just 300 feet below the fortress' outer perimeter, Elena encountered the first true technological barrier, the Charybdis Perimeter Network. The Charybdis was an invisible web of active infrared laser sensors that swept the vertical cliff faces continuously. The system didn't just look for physical obstructions, it measured the thermal variance of the rock. If a human body radiating a standard body temperature of 98 degrees Fahrenheit crossed an infrared beam, the system would instantly identify the thermal anomaly and deploy an automated defensive countermeasure, a series of high-pressure liquid nitrogen vents built into the cliff face that would flash freeze the climber, shattering them into fragments before they could fall. Elena stopped, her body pressed entirely flat against a narrow horizontal crevice. She pulled a specialized tactical monocular from her belt, sliding the filter to the ultraviolet spectrum.
The world turned a deep neon blue. Crossing the empty space above her were hundreds of thin, interlaced red lines, a dense, shifting grid of laser light that left no opening larger than a few inches. The lasers moved in a complex computer-generated algorithm, sweeping up and down the rock face in a 5-second cycle. To pass through, she had to become as cold as the mountain itself. Elena reached down to her tactical belt and activated her suit's endothermic regulation matrix. The internal lining of her adaptive suit instantly began to absorb her body heat, redirecting the thermal energy into a series of internal carbon sink crystals. Within 60 seconds, the exterior surface temperature of her clothing dropped precipitously, matching the exact ambient temperature of the frozen rock wall around her, -20 degrees. The physical toll was immediate and horrifying. Her skin turned a pale, sickly blue beneath her mask. Her breathing became shallow and slow, her heart rate dropping to a dangerous 25 beats per minute, a state of controlled clinical hypothermia. Her lips cracked, and her vision began to blur at the edges as her body fought to keep her core organs alive while sacrificing her extremities. 5 seconds, she counted in her dimming mind. The grid resets in 5 seconds. As the red laser line swept downward, passing directly over her body without triggering the thermal sensors, Elena moved. She exploded upward with a burst of frantic, silent energy. She slithered through a narrow gap in the grid, her shoulder blades brushing within millimeters of the lethal light beams. She reached the next ledge just as the lasers snapped back into position behind her. Her fingers were completely numb, the tips of her gloves covered in a layer of white frost. She had beaten the machine, but her body was on the verge of total collapse. She lay on the frozen stone platform, her chest rising and falling in microscopic movements, forcing her mind to stay conscious through sheer, unyielding willpower. She could not die here. Not yet. The architect of her nightmare was just a few hundred yards away. The ledge led directly to an automated ventilation shaft that fed fresh air into the lower levels of the fortress. Elena used a heavy tactical glass cutter to silently remove the steel intake mesh, sliding her thin frame into the dark metallic tunnel like a serpent entering a nest. The interior of the Eyrie was a clinical maze of brushed steel, white concrete, and fluorescent lighting. It smelled of ozone, gun oil, and expensive air filtration. This was the nerve center of the Syndicate's military wing, commanded by Director Abraham Thorne, the final name on Elena's ledger. Thorne was a ruthless technocrat, a former military general who had privatized his entire command network, selling his services to the highest corporate bidder. He was the man who had personally signed the Starlight Directive, the military operation that categorized Elena's home province as an expendable extraction zone, resulting in the complete annihilation of 40,000 innocent civilians to secure the rich lithium deposits beneath their soil. As Elena crawled out of the ventilation duct onto a secluded catwalk in the lower maintenance bay, she heard the rhythmic sound of heavy boots against the grated floor below. A patrol team of 2 elite Syndicate Black Ops soldiers was approaching. They were clad in heavy ceramic-plated shock armor, carrying short-barreled automatic shotguns equipped with thermal optics. Elena could not use her rifle. At this close range, even with a suppressor, the mechanical sound of the heavy bolt would echo through the concrete corridors. She had to rely on the brutal close-quarters skills she had once failed during her first weeks at the recruitment camp. She dropped from the catwalk like a shadow falling from the ceiling. She landed directly behind the second guard, her boots making absolutely zero sound against the rubberized floor. Before the soldier could register the shift in air pressure, Elena's right hand wrapped around his jaw, her fingers digging into his pressure points, while her left hand drove a heavy black titanium combat blade upward through the soft armor junction beneath his chin. The blade pierced the brainstem instantly. The soldier's eyes rolled back, his body going completely limp. Elena caught his collapsing frame, lowering him to the floor with fluid grace, preventing his heavy ceramic armor from clattering against the metal walls. The first guard heard the faint rustle of fabric and began to spin around, his shotgun rising toward her chest. "What the?" Elena didn't retreat. She stepped into his rotation, utilizing his own momentum against him. She grabbed the barrel of his shotgun, deflecting the weapon upward as she drove her knee violently into his exposed groin. As the guard buckled forward in pain, she wrapped both arms around his helmeted head, twisting her torso with a sudden, explosive snap. A loud, sickening crack echoed through the corridor as the soldier's cervical vertebrae shattered. He dropped to the floor beside his partner, dead before he could pull his trigger. Elena stood over the two fallen giants, her breathing perfectly controlled, her expression completely stoic. 6 months ago, a private in basic training had broken her ribs during a standard hand-to-hand drill, mocking her for having the arms of a child. Today, she had eliminated 2 of the most heavily trained operators in the world in less than 4 seconds with her bare hands. The weakness was completely gone. The weapon was fully operational. Elena dragged the bodies into the empty maintenance closet, stripped them of their security access cards, and made her way toward the highest point of the fortress, the aviation tower aqueduct. The aqueduct was an open-air concrete channel designed to redirect the massive amounts of meltwater from the mountain's upper glaciers away from the helipads. At this time of year, it was a dry, frozen trough of rough concrete that overhung the main central courtyard of the fortress. It was the perfect, ultimate sniper nest. It offered absolute visual dominance over the entire command pavilion while providing solid concrete cover against counter-battery fire. She unlatched the heavy polymer clips of her rifle case. She lifted the Blackwood 50 caliber from its foam inserts, assembling the massive weapon with mechanical familiarity. She locked the free-floating match barrel into the receiver, attached the high-magnification thermographic optic, and slid a 5-round magazine of specialized Valkyrie high-velocity monolithic rounds into the magazine well. The environmental variables at 14,000 feet were extreme and volatile. The air density was nearly 40% lower than it was at sea level. In ballistics, lower air density means the air molecules are scattered far apart. This meant that Elena's bullet would experience almost zero aerodynamic drag during its flight. It would travel significantly faster and retain its kinetic energy for a much longer distance. But the advantage was canceled out by a terrifying complication: the mountain updraft. The wind did not blow horizontally at the summit of the Eyrie. The massive vertical rock faces of the mountain acted like a ramp, forcing the high-velocity valley winds to rush straight upward into the sky. This created a violent, invisible vertical current that would catch a bullet from below, lifting it up like a piece of paper. If Elena fired a standard shot, the vertical wind drift would push her bullet 10 feet above the target's head. She opened her tactical logbook, her frozen fingers typing the coordinates into her ballistic calculator. At a distance of 1,500 meters with a 40-knot vertical updraft and a low barometric pressure of 500 millibars, she had to perform a highly unusual calculation. She didn't adjust her elevation dial up, she adjusted it down, significantly down. Through her scope, she would have to aim not at Thorne's head, but at the very base of the concrete stairs beneath his feet, trusting the violent upward rush of the mountain wind to drag the bullet up into his chest cavity. She settled into the prone position inside the concrete aqueduct, the frozen wind whipping across her back, her crosshairs locking onto the glass-enclosed command pavilion across the courtyard. The stage was set for the final deletion. At 0900 hours, the heavy steel blast doors of the command pavilion slid open. Director Abraham Thorne stepped into the crisp morning sunlight, surrounded by an entourage of corporate dignitaries and security chiefs. He was an older man, his hair a pristine silver, his tailored military uniform adorned with medals from a dozen forgotten proxy wars. He carried himself with the supreme, unshakable confidence of a man who believed he had built an impenetrable wall between himself and the consequences of his actions. But as Elena tracked his movements through her high-powered optic, her brow furrowed slightly. Thorne didn't move alone. He was accompanied by two other men who possessed the exact same physical build, the exact same silver hair, and the exact same uniform. They walked in a tight, shifting triangular formation, their movements synchronized to absolute perfection. The Raven Protocol. Thorne was a master of intelligence. He knew that the Iron Wolves had deployed a lethal asset who had eliminated his top commanders. To protect himself, he had deployed two physical decoys, surgically altered body doubles who shared his exact biometric signatures. Through the thermographic scope, all three men radiated the exact same heat signature. They wore identical anti-ballistic vests beneath their uniforms, and they constantly shifted positions as they walked across the courtyard, making it completely impossible to determine who the real director was.
If Elena fired and hit a decoy, the remaining two men would instantly be rushed into the underground bunker by their security detail, and the Eyrie would lock down permanently. She had one single bullet, and she had to choose between three identical faces. Elena did not panic. She did not let her frustration accelerate her heart rate. She lowered her finger from the trigger and simply observed. Every human being has a glitch, Kaylin had told her during her final week at the Ghost Cage. A machine operates on pure code, but a human operates on habit. Find the habit, and you find the man. She watched the three men approach a low concrete wall overlooking the valley. The first man pulled a gold pocket watch from his vest, checking the time with a smooth, practiced motion. The second man stood perfectly straight, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, his eyes scanning the security towers. The third man reached into his pocket, pulled out a small silver pen, and began to rhythmically click the top with his thumb. Elena's mind flashed back to the intelligence dossiers she had memorized during her journey on the Leviathan. Director Abraham Thorne had suffered a severe shrapnel wound to his right shoulder during the siege of the eastern provinces 15 years ago. The official medical report stated that he had retained full mobility, but he suffered from chronic, low-level nerve degradation in his right hand, a condition that made fine motor skills, like clicking a pen or holding a watch, incredibly uncomfortable over extended periods. The first man used his right hand effortlessly. The third man was clicking the pen with his right thumb, showing no signs of discomfort. But the second man, the man with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Elena zoomed the magnification of her optic to its absolute limit, focusing entirely on his right wrist. There it was, a microscopic involuntary tremor, a tiny rhythmic twitch of the tendons in his right forearm, hidden away from the world behind his back. He wasn't holding his hands behind his back to look commanding. He was doing it to anchor his trembling hand, concealing his physical vulnerability from his subordinates. He was the real Thorne. The other two were nothing but puppets of flesh and bone. "Found you," Elena whispered, her voice a cold hiss that vanished into the wind.
She shifted her crosshairs away from Thorne's face. She lowered the reticle, passing down his throat, down his chest, past his knees, until the center intersection of her scope was locked onto the third concrete step below his boots.
The mountain updraft had increased in velocity. The wind gauge on her tactical display was flashing a violet-red warning, 45 knots, vertical vector. The distance was exactly 1,520 meters, nearly a mile of empty, treacherous airspace. The bullet would take nearly 2 full seconds to cross the distance. In those 2 seconds, the target could step forward, step backward, or turn away. She had to predict the future. Thorn turned to his left, preparing to speak to one of the corporate dignitaries. He lifted his foot, beginning a slow, measured step forward toward the edge of the pavilion. Elena didn't wait for him to finish the step. She calculated the velocity of his movement, adjusted her hold by 3 inches to the left to account for the Earth's rotation, and squeezed the trigger. The Blackwood rifle let out a deafening, catastrophic roar that shook the concrete aqueduct. A massive plume of white vapor erupted from the muzzle brake, instantly dissipated by the freezing mountain wind. The Valkyrie monolithic projectile exited the barrel at a staggering 3,500 feet per second, slicing through the thin, low-pressure air of the summit like a meteor. As it crossed the open courtyard, the massive upward surge of the mountain wind caught the bullet from below, violently lifting the projectile upward in a steep, curved trajectory, exactly as Elena had calculated. The bullet climbed higher and higher, defying the standard rules of gravity, carried upward by the breath of the mountain itself. Thorn completed his step. His foot touched the concrete floor. At that exact millisecond, the heavy .50 caliber projectile completed its vertical arc, plunging straight through the reinforced glass roof of the pavilion and struck Director Abraham Thorn directly through the center of his collarbone. The power of the high-velocity monolithic round was absolute. At that velocity and weight, the bullet didn't just penetrate, it caused a massive hydrostatic shockwave that tore through his chest cavity, destroying his heart and shattering his spine instantly. Thorn was thrown backward against the concrete wall, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated shock, before he slid to the floor in a pool of dark, smoking crimson.
The 2 decoys stood frozen, their mouths open in terror, completely unharmed. The security alarms erupted into a deafening, rhythmic scream. "Sniper! Sniper on the upper ridge! Activate all automated defenses!" The twin-rotor autocannons on the suspension bridge spun around frantically, their search lasers scanning the aqueduct. A barrage of high-explosive shells began to slam into the outer walls of the concrete channel, showering Elena in white dust and jagged fragments of stone. But she didn't run. She didn't seek cover. She slowly stood up from the concrete trough, her rifle held firmly at her side. She looked down at the chaotic, screaming fortress below her, her face completely uncovered, her smudged black war paint reflecting the harsh morning light. The ledger was officially clear. The men who had burned her village, the commanders who had called her weak, and the warlords who had turned her into a ghost were all dead, buried beneath the soil they had tried to steal. Elena turned her back on the burning, panicked fortress of the Eyrie, stepping into the thick white fog of the mountain peaks. She had entered the Iron Wolf camp as a broken girl seeking a hiding place. She was leaving it as a legend that would haunt the nightmares of every tyrant in the world for decades to come. They had called her weak, but iron never breaks. The victory at the Eyrie should have been the end of the line. The ledger was clear, the high command of the Syndicate lay in ruins, and the names written in blood in Elena's notebook had all been systematically crossed out. But in the dark, cold world of global mercenaries, a vacuum never stays empty for long. 3 days after descending from the frozen peaks of the Razorback Mountains, Elena sat in the underbelly of an abandoned rail yard on the outskirts of Sector 0, a vast industrial wasteland choked by radioactive dust and shifting chemical fog. She wasn't resting. She was sitting on an overturned steel crate, carefully disassembling the firing pin of her Blackwood .50 caliber rifle. Suddenly, her secure tactical comms clicked.
It wasn't Commander Vance's voice that filled her earpiece. It was a distorted, heavily encrypted audio feed that hissed with static. "You crossed out the names, little ghost," a smooth, unfamiliar voice whispered through the receiver. "You thought you were a scalpel cutting away a cancer, but you failed to realize that the men you killed were just fingers on a much larger hand. And now, that hand is closing around you."
Elena didn't stop cleaning the firing pin. Her movements remained perfectly fluid, mechanical, and calm. "Identify yourself." "They used to call me the First Wolf," the voice replied, followed by a low, chilling chuckle. "Before Vance took the commander's chair, I built the framework of the Iron Wolf Sniper Division. I trained Kalen. I wrote the ballistics manuals you memorized in the ghost cage. And now, the Syndicate has paid me a sum of money that could buy a small nation to do one simple job: erase the mistake that Vance created." The line went completely dead. Elena slowly reassembled her rifle. She didn't panic, but every tactical instinct in her body went on absolute high alert status. She realized she had fallen into the ultimate trap. The Syndicate hadn't just lost their leaders, they had used the deaths of Eyrie, Cross, and Thorn to draw out the Iron Wolf's absolute deadliest asset into the open, away from her support network, into a sector completely controlled by an absolute master of long-range assassination. She was no longer the apex predator. She was the prey. The exclusion zone of Sector Zero was a nightmare landscape for any marksman. The remnants of a destroyed nuclear reactor core 5 miles away had left the entire area permanently blanketed in a thick, shimmering orange haze. The air was heavy with ionized particles, creating an atmospheric phenomenon known as a thermal mirage grid. Through her variable optic, the world looked warped and unstable. The heat rising from the contaminated soil caused the horizon to bend and ripple, making objects appear 3 to 4 feet away from their actual physical locations. In ballistics, a thermal mirage is a sniper's worst enemy. It bends the light entering the lens, completely destroying the accuracy of a standard crosshair alignment. To make matters worse, her electronic rangefinder was completely useless. The heavy radiation in the air scattered the infrared laser pulses, giving her erratic, chaotic readings that bounced between 50 meters and 3,000 meters in a fraction of a second. She had to rely on the ancient, forgotten method of range estimation, the mil-dot calculation system. Elena locked her eyes onto a rusted, standard-issue industrial fuel tank located across the rail yard. She knew the exact height of that specific model of tank was exactly 8 feet tall. She looked through her reticle, measuring how many microscopic dots, or mils, the tank occupied from top to bottom. 4 mils high, she calculated in her head. She ran the mathematical formula instantly. Height of the target in yards multiplied by 1,000 divided by the number of mils. Distance is exactly 660 meters. It was a primitive way to map a battlefield, but mathematics did not require a battery or an electronic signal. While her hunter was likely relying on satellite links and advanced sensor grids, Elena was reducing the entire industrial wasteland to pure, unyielding geometry. She slipped into the shadows of a collapsed train car, her adaptive camouflage suit shifting to a brilliant, high-contrast palette of industrial rust and dark teal, the exact colors of the decaying metal structures around her. She became a permanent, invisible fixture of the wreckage. The silence of Sector Zero was absolute, broken only by the occasional metallic groan of a collapsing roof, or the distant hiss of chemical steam escaping a rusted pipe. Suddenly, a microscopic flash of green light caught the corner of Elena's eye.
It lasted for less than a millisecond, appearing on the rusted surface of a crane tower nearly 1,000 meters away. An ordinary soldier would have ignored it, assuming it was a reflection of the toxic sun against a piece of glass. But Elena knew better. That green flash was the reflection of an anti-reflective optical matrix, AROM, a highly specialized coating used exclusively on the scopes of Black Ops counter-snipers to prevent lens flare. The first wolf was out there, and he had already established his firing position. Elena didn't move an inch. She knew that the moment her body shifted, the subtle change in the shadow pattern beneath the train car would betray her position to a master hunter. She lay perfectly flat on her stomach, her cheek welded firmly to the cold polymer stock of her Blackwood rifle. Then, a sudden, deafening explosion rocked the southern perimeter of the rail yard. A massive fuel line, intentionally sabotaged, erupted into a towering wall of orange fire and black smoke. The concussion wave tore through the area, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris raining down upon the train cars.
It was a classic distraction tactic. The first wolf wanted her to look toward the explosion, to move her head, to break her concealment. Elena didn't blink. She kept her scope locked entirely on the crane tower 1,000 meters away. She knew that during a massive explosion, the rapid change in air pressure and temperature creates a temporary vacuum wave that alters the path of any bullet traveling through its wake. If she fired now, the heat from the burning fuel line would drag her round into the dirt. Through the smoke of the explosion, she saw a tiny human-shaped silhouette slowly rise from the top platform of the crane. The figure wasn't aiming at her. He was holding a heavy, high-velocity weapon aimed directly at the support columns of a massive multi-ton overhead crane system suspended directly above Elena's position. He wasn't trying to shoot her through her cover. He was trying to bring the entire industrial ceiling down upon her skull. Crack! A heavy, tungsten-core sabot round tore through the air from the crane tower, striking the primary support pin of the overhead structure. The metal sheared with a horrific screeching roar, and thousands of tons of twisted iron began to collapse toward the ground, directly over Elena's train car. Elena exploded into movement. She didn't run backward, she dove forward, sliding beneath the heavy reinforced steel axle of a massive industrial locomotive just as the collapsing crane slammed into the earth behind her. The impact was cataclysmic. A wall of white dust, rust, and shattered concrete erupted into the air, completely obliterating all visibility within a 200-meter radius. The shockwave threw her against the steel wheel of the train, bruising her ribs and cutting her forehead, but she didn't drop her weapon. Through the blinding dust cloud, she heard the distant rhythmic sound of a heavy bolt-action rifle cycling. The first wolf was checking his work. He assumed she was crushed beneath the wreckage, or at the very least pinned down and incapacitated. Elena wiped the blood from her left eye, her vision clearing just enough to see the environment through the haze. The dust cloud was dense, but it provided her with a temporary, absolute visual barrier. The enemy could not see her, but because of her specialized thermographic variable lens, she could see the thermal bloom of his weapon's barrel, which was still radiating intense heat from the high-velocity shot. She set up her bipod directly on the rusted steel rail beneath her boots. The distance was exactly 980 meters. The wind was a chaotic mess, superheated by the burning fuel line, creating an upward thermal draft that was shifting 3 clicks to the left every 2 seconds. "You taught Kalen," Elena whispered, her teeth bared in a silent, predatory snarl. "But Kalen didn't teach me how to follow your rules. He taught me how to break them." She adjusted her elevation dial by 11 clicks up, then manually held the reticle 2 inches low and to the left to compensate for the thermal lift of the burning wreckage. Inhale. Exhale. Hold. The space between her heartbeats arrived, but it was corrupted by the pounding adrenaline of her survival. She forced her lungs to freeze, locking her chest cavity into a rigid, unyielding muscle and bone. She pulled the trigger. The Blackwood rifle let out a ferocious roar that cut through the sound of the burning metal. The heavy caliber round punched clean through the rusted side of the locomotive axle, using the steel as a natural barrel extension, and rocketed into the dark dust cloud. 1,000 meters away, on the high platform of the crane tower, the first wolf was just about to pack his gear. He was a veteran of 100 covert operations, a man who had never failed a contract in 30 years of active service. Suddenly, a heavy .50 caliber bullet tore through the floorboards of his metal platform, completely ignoring the structural steel armor he had set up as cover. The round didn't hit his chest, it struck the receiver of his custom sniper weapon, shattering the heavy steel bolt mechanism and driving the razor-sharp fragments directly into his right hand and forearm. The veteran hunter let out a sharp cry of agony, dropping his ruined weapon as he fell backward against the safety railing. He stared down at his mangled fingers, then looked through the dust cloud toward the rail yard below in absolute, terrified disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered, his voice trembling through his personal comms unit. "No one can calculate a blind shot through a thermal mirage and a collapsing structure. No one." Elena's voice broke through his encryption line, cold, steady, and utterly terrifying. "The math doesn't care about your reputation," she said, her voice sounding as if she were standing right behind him in the dark. "It only cares about the trajectory." Through his binoculars, using his left hand, the first wolf looked down at the rail yard. Through the clearing dust, he saw her. Elena had stepped out from beneath the massive locomotive wheel. She wasn't running for cover. She was standing perfectly straight in the center of the open tracks, her heavy rifle resting in her grip, her face smudged with black war paint and fresh blood. She aligned her crosshairs one final time, locking the center intersection directly onto the fuel reservoir tank located at the base of the first wolf's crane tower. She didn't give him a second chance to speak. She didn't offer a dramatic farewell. Crack! The final bullet struck the pressurized valve of the tower's generator system. A blinding secondary explosion tore through the base of the crane, tearing the metal legs apart and sending the entire 1,000-foot structure tilting violently toward the radioactive earth below. The first wolf, along with his legendary reputation and his corporate contract, vanished into a massive cataclysm of twisted iron, smoke, and fire. Elena stood alone in the smoking ruins of Sector 0. The air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and ozone, but the immediate threat had been permanently eliminated. She unslung her rifle, checking the chamber to ensure the weapon was clear, before walking toward the shattered remains of the enemy sniper's primary command console that had been thrown clear of the explosion. She knelt down in the dirt, her fingers flipping open a burning leather portfolio that had belonged to the first wolf. Inside lay a highly classified, encrypted data drive bearing a digital seal she recognized instantly. It wasn't a Syndicate seal. It was the elite, high-command crest of the Iron Wolf Private Military Corporation.
Elena's eyes narrowed into slivers of cold steel. The data drive contained an explicit multi-million-dollar transaction authorized directly from the personal account of Commander Vance. The contract details were explicitly clear. Eliminate Recruit 404. Erase all connection to the Border Province pacification campaigns. Clean the ledger permanently. The truth was a cold, jagged knife in her chest. The Syndicate hadn't hired the first wolf to hunt her down. Her own commander, the man who had given her the rifle, the man who had guided her through the training, the man who had used her to eliminate his corporate rivals, had set her up from the very beginning. She was never his prized soldier. She was just an untraceable cleanup tool meant to be disposed of the moment the job was finished. Elena slowly closed the portfolio, her breathing dropping to a dead, terrifying calm. The trauma of her past was gone, replaced by a crystalline, hyper-focused reality. The war wasn't over. The enemies she had killed were just the outer walls of a fortress of absolute corruption, and the man who held the keys was sitting in the high command chair of the Leviathan. She slipped the encrypted data drive into her tactical vest, picked up her Blackwood 50 caliber rifle, and turned her back on the burning ruins of Sector 0. She had spent months hunting the ghosts of her past. Now she was going to hunt the man who created them. The black hull of the Leviathan cut through the midnight sea like a razor blade slicing through silk. The 300-meter corporate flagship was an unyielding fortress of militarized steel, floating in international waters 40 miles off the coast of Sector 0. It served as the mobile command matrix for the entire Iron Wolf private military corporation. It was equipped with automated close-in weapon systems, multi-spectrum sonar arrays, and an elite battalion of loyalty-conditioned mercenaries who answered only to one man, Commander Vance. To the world, the Leviathan was an untouchable symbol of privatized global power. To Elena, it was simply the final target on an absolute ledger of blood. She approached the massive vessel from the blind spot of its primary radar sweep, riding the crest of a violent 30-foot ocean swell on a modified underwater propulsion sled. The freezing salt spray slammed against her tactical mask, but her eyes remained wide, unblinking, and entirely focused on the structural underbelly of the ship. She wore her fully calibrated adaptive camouflage suit, now dialed to a deep, abysmal obsidian black to mimic the exact light absorption properties of the midnight ocean. On her back rested the hard case of her Blackwood .50 caliber rifle, sealed inside a pressurized, watertight polymer skin.
Vance thought she was dead. He believed the first wolf had turned her into ash in the radioactive ruins of Sector 0. That belief was his ultimate tactical vulnerability. Arrogance makes a commander predictable. Predictability, in the unyielding laws of ballistics and warfare, is a terminal diagnosis. Elena released the propulsion sled, letting her body drift silently into the churning white foam created by the flagship's massive starboard propeller screws. She reached up, firing a high-tension carbon fiber grappling line from her wrist gauntlet toward the structural drainage lattice of the lower maintenance deck. The magnetic anchor locked onto the steel hull with a muffled metallic click that was instantly swallowed by the roaring thunder of the ocean engines. Elena pulled herself upward, climbing the vertical steel wall with the fluid, effortless grace of a phantom rising from the deep. 6 months ago, she was a shivering, hollow-eyed refugee who could barely lift a standard-issue field pack. Tonight, she was scaling the walls of the world's most heavily guarded military flagship, carrying 30 pounds of precision steel and a mind completely stripped of fear. The transformation was absolute. The weakness had been entirely replaced by iron. Elena slipped through the pneumatic seals of the primary bilge drainage port, entering the hot, oil-slicked labyrinth of the ship's lower engineering decks. The air here was a suffocating mix of superheated steam, diesel fuel, and the mechanical scream of multi-ton turbine engines. She knelt in the shadows of a massive hydraulic line, unzipping the waterproof skin of her rifle case. She assembled the Blackwood system in absolute darkness, her fingers moving with pure muscle memory, identifying every pin, every bolt, and every latch entirely by touch. She locked the heavy fluted barrel into the receiver, slid a 5-round magazine of tungsten core sabot rounds into the well, and checked the chamber. 1 in the pipe. Suddenly, the heavy steel door at the end of the catwalk hissed open. 2 Iron Wolf security officers stepped into the bay, their heavy submachine guns held at low ready positions. They weren't standard corporate grunts, they wore the crimson shoulder crest of Vance's personal Praetorian Guard. "We have a localized pressure drop in bilge sector 4, the first guard muttered into his throat mic, his eyes scanning the pipe network. "Checking the seal now." They walked directly toward Elena's position, their heavy combat boots clacking rhythmically against the metal grating. Elena didn't retreat into the pipes. She didn't raise her rifle. At this ultra-close range, a high-caliber sniper weapon was an impediment.
Instead, she dissolved backward into the narrow crevice between two massive steam valves, her fiber-optic suit shifting its light matrix to mimic the exact rusted teal and copper tones of the industrial machinery behind her. The first guard passed within 12 inches of her shoulder. He didn't see a human being. His eyes translated her form as nothing more than a curved segment of a high-pressure pipe. As the second guard stepped past, Elena exploded from the shadows like a spring-loaded blade. Her left hand shot forward, wrapping around his throat from behind, compressing his carotid artery to prevent him from screaming into his comms, while her right hand drove a slender, micro-serrated carbon needle upward through the soft seal at the base of his skull. The guard's body went completely rigid, his nervous system instantly paralyzed as the needle severed his upper spinal cord. Before the first guard could even turn his head to check on his partner, Elena caught the falling body with her left shoulder, using its momentum to swing herself forward. She extended her right leg, sweeping the first guard's ankles out from under him, sending him crashing face first into the metal catwalk floor. She dropped her weight directly onto his back, her knee pinning his shoulder blades to the steel, while her hands twisted his helmeted head backward in a sudden, violent torque. A sharp, metallic snap echoed through the engine bay, instantly silenced by the roar of the turbines. Elena stood up, her breathing perfectly rhythmic, her pulse hovering at a completely stable 58 beats per minute. She dragged the two heavy bodies over the railing, dropping them silently into the churning black bilge waters below the floorboards. She pulled her secure tactical data drive from her vest, plugging it into the sector's localized routing console. The encryption keys she had stolen from the first Wolf's corpse bypassed the ship's firewalls in less than 3 seconds. The terminal display flashed a solid glowing blue. Access granted. Primary elevator controls overwritten. The path to the high command bridge was wide open. The command deck of the Leviathan was a panoramic dome of reinforced structural glass that looked out over the endless, dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The room was bathed in a dim, crimson battle light, filled with the low hum of advanced satellite arrays and global tracking monitors. Commander Vance stood at the central holographic terminal, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, his heavy military trench coat draped over his broad shoulders. The deep scars across his face twitched slightly as he studied the real-time operational data from the global sectors. With Cross dead and Thorn eliminated, the corporate boards have no choice but to consolidate all security contracts under the Iron Wolf flag, Vance said, his deep, gravelly voice echoing through the quiet bridge. He was speaking to his chief of staff, a cold, clinical intelligence officer who stood nearby with a digital ledger. We didn't just survive the Syndicate war, we inherited it. Every asset, every territory, every dollar is ours now. And what of the sniper, sir? The officer asked quietly. Recruit 404? The reports from Sector 0 indicate the first Wolf's position was entirely obliterated, but we have found no physical trace of her remains. Vance let out a low, dismissive chuckle, turning away from the hologram. It doesn't matter if her bones are turned to dust or buried in the mud. She was a broken little girl who lasted exactly as long as I needed her to. She cleared the board for me, and then she was deleted by the man who invented the system. She was a ghost, Captain, and ghosts don't return from the dead. You should have checked the math, Vance. The voice didn't come from the radio or the intercom. It came from the absolute darkness of the observation balcony at the rear of the bridge. Vance froze, his muscles instantly locking into a rigid defensive posture. The intelligence officer spun around, his hand frantically reaching for the sidearm holstered at his hip. Crack! A low-profile supersonic round tore through the crimson light of the bridge before his fingers could even touch the leather of his holster. The force of the impact threw his body backward across the holographic projector, shattering the blue laser arrays into a spray of brilliant sparks. Elena stepped out from the shadows of the balcony curtain. She held her Blackwood .50 caliber rifle at hip level, the smoking muzzle aimed directly at Vance's chest. Her adaptive camouflage suit had ceased its color-shifting matrix, settling into a solid, unyielding matte black that made her look like an executioner carved out of the midnight sky. Her face was fully exposed, her smudged black war paint accentuating the absolute, terrifying coldness of her dark eyes. Vance slowly raised his hands, his expression shifting from utter shock to a twisted, admiring grin.
"Elena," Vance whispered, his voice steady despite the rifle aimed at his heart. "I have to admit, you continue to exceed my highest projections. You survived the peaks, you bypassed the Aegis, and you even put down the first wolf. I didn't think you had that level of calculated cruelty in you." "You didn't give me a choice," Elena said, her voice a flat, dead line that chilled the air of the bridge. "You burned my home to create a weapon. Now the weapon is in front of you." "I didn't burn your village, girl," Vance countered, taking a slow, deliberate step to the left, his eyes tracking the alignment of her rifle barrel. "The Syndicate did that. I simply found you in the ashes. I gave you a purpose. I gave you a name. I gave you the finest rifle in the world and taught you to become an apex predator. If it wasn't for me, you would have died as a nameless refugee in a ditch 6 months ago." "You authorized the Starlight Directive," Elena said, her finger tightening by a fraction of a millimeter against the cold, match-grade trigger. "You signed the paper that categorized 40,000 innocent people as collateral waste to clear the land for your corporate backers. You didn't save me, Vance. You manufactured a tool to clean up your executioners so you could claim the throne alone." Vance stopped his movement, his smile fading, replaced by the cold, unyielding mask of a lifetime warlord. "That is the reality of the world we live in, Elena," Vance hissed, his voice dropping to a gravelly snarl. "The weak are meat, and the strong eat them. That village was a collection of mud huts sitting on top of the world's most valuable energy reserve. If I hadn't cleared it, someone else would have. I used that destruction to build something greater. I built the Iron Wolves. I built a shield that protects the stability of this entire hemisphere. You think you're a hero seeking justice? You're just a broken child throwing a tantrum because the universe is cruel." Elena looked through the glass of the bridge, watching the dark waves of the ocean crash against the hull far below. The past, the screams, the smoke, the terrifying vulnerability of her childhood flashed through her mind one final time. But it didn't trigger a tremor. It didn't accelerate her pulse. The trauma had no power over her anymore. It had been fully processed, quantified, and reduced to a closed mathematical equation. "I am not a hero," Elena whispered, her eyes locking onto the space between Vance's eyebrows. "And I don't care about your shield. I am just the variable you forgot to clear from your spreadsheet." Vance's eyes narrowed. In that split second, he realized that negotiation was entirely impossible. He didn't see fear or hesitation in her face. He saw the exact same cold, clinical finality he had seen in the eyes of Master Sniper Kalen before his retirement. Vance reached down to his tactical belt, his thumb smashing the emergency override button on his personal wrist terminal. "Activate Protocol Omega," Vance roared. "Lock down the bridge." Instantly, a series of multi-layered 3-inch thick structural steel security shutters began to slide downward from the ceiling of the bridge, designed to seal off the command deck from the rest of the ship in the event of a catastrophic mutiny or boarding action. At the same time, a localized disruption pulse matrix on the ceiling activated, emitting an intense high-frequency electromagnetic field that completely scrambled all digital optics and laser sights within the room.
Elena's advanced thermographic scope went completely dark, the electronic crosshairs replaced by a chaotic screen of green static and error codes. Vance didn't run for the door. He dove behind the heavy reinforced titanium command console in the center of the room, drawing a high-capacity automatic pistol from beneath his coat. "You're blind now, Ghost," Vance shouted from behind the cover, his voice echoing through the metallic enclosure as the steel shutters slammed into the floorboards, sealing the bridge into a pitch-black, windowless tomb. "Your fancy rifle is nothing but a heavy piece of iron without your computer sights. I know every square inch of this deck. You're trapped in a box with an old wolf." The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint dying blue sparks from the ruined holographic projector. The electronic silence was absolute. Elena didn't panic. She didn't try to reboot her scope. She reached up, her fingers calmly detaching the multi-million-dollar digital optic from the top rail of her Blackwood rifle, tossing the scrambled computer system onto the floorboards with a dull plastic thud. She didn't need a computer. She didn't need electronic crosshairs. She reached down to her side rail, flipping up the manual, mechanical iron sights, two simple, unyielding pieces of notched steel that required no battery, no radar, and no digital signal to function. She closed her eyes entirely. In the pitch darkness of the sealed bridge, her auditory processing became her primary sensory network. She listened through the mechanical thrum of the ship's distant engines. She listened through the hiss of the dying electrical wires. She searched for the human glitch. There, a heavy, slightly irregular intake of air exactly 12 meters away, positioned behind the left corner of the titanium console. It was Vance's breath. He was an older man, his lungs hardened by decades of cigar smoke and battlefield dust. His respiration carried a faint, whistling wheeze that was unmistakable to an apex hunter who had learned the science of breathing in the silent snow of the northern peaks. Elena raised the rifle, her cheek resting against the cold metal stock. She aligned the front post of her iron sights with the origin point of the wheezing sound in the dark. She factored the distance, 12 meters. At this range, there was no Coriolis effect. There was no aerodynamic jump. There was no mountain updraft or tropical humidity variance. The ballistics were pure, simple, and absolute. Vance shifted his weight behind the console, his heavy leather boots scraping against a stray copper wire on the floor, a tiny, microscopic sound that lasted for less than a millisecond. Elena didn't wait for him to step out from cover. She knew that a tungsten-core sabot round fired from a Blackwood .50 caliber rifle possessed a muzzle energy of over 13,000 foot-pounds, a force capable of punching clean through an industrial engine block or 3 inches of reinforced structural titanium. Vance's console wasn't a shield. It was just a temporary delay. Inhale, exhale, hold. The space arrived. The universe went entirely dead silent. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the unsuppressed .50 caliber round inside the enclosed steel bridge was catastrophic. The muzzle flash was a brief, brilliant explosion of white and orange light that illuminated the entire room for a fraction of a second like a bolt of lightning. The heavy tungsten round exited the barrel, slicing through the air at 3,000 feet per second and struck the left corner of the reinforced titanium command console. The structural metal did not deflect the bullet. It shattered under the sheer, unyielding kinetic energy of the projectile. The round punched clean through the titanium plates, expanding as it exited the rear casing and struck Commander Vance directly through the center of his chest armor. The impact was definitive. The force of the heavy round threw Vance's massive frame backward through the air, smashing his body into the structural steel shutters behind him before he slid down onto the metal deck. The echoes of the gunshots slowly faded, replaced once again by the low, hollow hum of the ship's engines. Elena slowly opened her eyes. The emergency backup lights of the bridge finally flickered to life, bathing the room in a pale amber glow. She walked across the deck, her boots crunching against the shattered glass and ruined wires, until she stood directly over the fallen commander. Vance was still breathing, but his breaths were short, wet, and shallow. The heavy armor vest beneath his coat had been completely pulverized by the tungsten core. He looked up at the young woman standing above him, his lips covered in a thin line of dark crimson blood, his eyes wide with a mixture of agony and raw, unadulterated awe. "You really are a ghost," Vance gasped, his fingers trembling as they clutched at his shattered chest. "Who are you?" Elena lowered the barrel of her rifle until the steel muzzle was resting gently at the very center of his forehead. She looked down at him without a single trace of anger, hatred, or triumph in her expression. Her face was completely stoic, her eyes as cold and deep as the midnight ocean outside the hull.
"I am the variable you forgot to clear," she whispered. Crack! The final bullet was fired. The ledger was officially closed. The architect of the Iron Wolves, the master of proxy wars, and the man who believed the weak were nothing but meat was dead, his blood pooling silently among the ruined machinery of his own creation. Elena slowly lowered her weapon, cycling the heavy bolt one last time. A single smoking brass casing ejected from the chamber, falling onto the steel deck with a clear, metallic ring that marked the absolute conclusion of her journey. She turned away from the corpse, walked to the primary emergency console, and inserted her tactical data drive. She initiated a permanent, unerasable global broadcast command, uploading every file, every document, and every piece of encryption regarding the Starlight Directive and the corporate corruption of the Iron Wolves directly to every major intelligence network and news matrix in the world. The fortress of lies had been dismantled from the inside out. Elena walked toward the emergency exit lift, her adaptive camouflage suit shifting once again into the deep dark teal and orange tones of the amber bridge lights. She had entered the world of mercenaries as a broken victim of warfare, a girl they had called too weak to survive the dirt. Tonight, she was leaving it as an independent legend, a shadow that would forever guard the space between the crosshairs, ensuring that the tyrants of the world would never sleep soundly beneath an open sky. They called her weak, but iron is eternal. They built the machines to calculate the wind, they built the fortresses to block the sky, but they forgot that the deadliest weapon on Earth doesn't run on electricity. It runs on a ledger that never forgets. Vance thought she was meat, the Syndicate thought she was a ghost, but Elena proved that when you strip a human being of everything they love, all that remains is iron, and iron never breaks. The wolves are dead, the ledger is clear, but the sky is still wide open. If you have the stomach to survive the next deployment, lock your coordinates into our grid. Subscribe, leave a like on this video, and if you stood watch with the ghost until the final casing hit the steel, drop the word iron in the comments below. Until the next target, stay out of the light, stay frosty.